Hey everyone, my name's Rikin, and I have the pleasure of being the last talk Android Worldwide again. Actually, um, I did this conference almost it feels like a year ago, and I was also the last talk for that one too. So two for two, which is great also because I did not have a lot of time to practice, so I have no idea if I'll be on my allotted time. But since I'm the last talk, the worst case that will really happen is you all can just start funneling out of here. It's not a problem. Um, all that aside, I'm really excited to be here. This was my first conference talk, like I said, almost a year ago. I'm glad to be back, and I'm really excited to kind of talk about this stuff and the stuff being architecture libraries. So, yeah, let's get into it. But first of all, who am I? Well, I like to describe myself in three ways. Primarily, I like to snowboard and make coffee. Uh, but during the day, you'll find me doing Android things at Pinterest. I've been working there for almost 4 years now. And I've been an Android developer for almost 7-ish years. So, yeah, I have quite the tolerance for pain, one might say. So why this talk in particular? Well, I guess the primary reason is I'm kind of selfish. I have always wanted to just use these libraries in some way, get a feel for how they were built and how it feels using them. And I think there are going to be some useful takeaways here. Smart people are working on state management solutions, and I feel like it's worth trying them out and seeing if they're practical to use. And then I guess the other thing is that Jetpack Compose has a somewhat opinionated UI on, or opinionated way on how UI should consume state. So it's also worth checking out if these libraries might be worth it for any new Compose first applications. Um, so just to give a brief agenda of what we'll be talking through, I'm going to show you an application that I built for this talk, and we're going to be kind of building it multiple times using the various libraries. And basically, we're going to evaluate those libraries through the context of building this demo app. Then I'm going to do kind of a code walkthrough as we walk through some of the core parts of the application, maybe through the lens of a particular feature in the application that's written with both of these libraries. I'll do a quick comparison over some of the metrics that I'll talk about in a sec. And then we'll just talk about my personal takeaways from this. So the two libraries that I chose, and I know that initially it said that I was actually going to compare three, but due to time constraints, I ended up only getting to really leverage and use these two libraries. But the two libraries I'm going to be looking into is Mavericks by Airbnb and Workflow by Square. And why these two? Well, they're both somewhat vetted and used by fairly large companies, and they're both quite different. But after looking into and using them, so I think it'll be good for comparison. Um, I'll also be kind of using this, and I kind of mentioned this with the demo app, but it's using these libraries, building a Jetpack Compose first application. So kind of built with Jetpack Compose in mind. And just a few disclaimers before I get deeper into this is that this isn't really going to be a super deep dive into the libraries. In fact, I still wouldn't consider myself an expert on either of these. And the code that you see will not necessarily be the cleanest or very library idiomatic at times, but I think that makes it a little bit more authentic and kind of shows how I kind of figured out how to use the library for my own purposes. and whether or not it's like the most correct way, I guess, can be determined. But it'll be kind of like my personal experience using these libraries and getting things to work. It also won't be a super complex use case. I did not replace like the Pinterest app using these libraries. This demo app is significantly smaller, but I think it still should show like some of the capabilities of these libraries. And just to kind of ground it and keep things simple, I'm not going to cover things like modularization and like using Dagger with modularization for dependency injection. But it's something that these libraries are capable of leveraging, and something I'd like to explore in the future. So let's kind of go over how I'm going to compare them. And I was going kind of back and forth on this, but as I was using them, the three things that kind of came to mind were these three here, which is complexity. So is the library easy to use? Is it flexible enough to work with my existing setup, or is there a fairly rigid structure on how I use it? Is it opinionated? Does it have like a clear opinion on how to set up your application? Does it cover more than just like the state management piece? And the documentation, because this was a big one. Is it well documented? Can I kind of learn everything I need to know to feel productive using these libraries? Uh, enough to make more than just like a simple tutorial application from the docs? And are there like examples of like common scenarios I might face? Okay. So yeah, so I'll briefly show you like a little bit of the demo app, and I'll actually like switch to it. But for now, this is like the application that I built. I call it Hydro Homey. It's just a app that's gonna use as a water tracker to track your water consumption and kind of motivate you to hit your water drinking goal every day. I know you're all probably very upset that I'm not going to be demoing a to-do list application to show off these two architectural libraries, but hopefully you're okay with me going a bit against the grain here. Just like in the screenshots here, these are the three core features of the application. You have like your daily hydration, which is like the screenshot on the far left, which shows you how much water you drank during the day compared to where your goal is. You have like your current streak, which actually is just like your kind of week at a glance, and to show you how you're doing this week. And then you have the settings feature, which will allow you to like modify things like what your goal is and like what your default drink size is. So when you're incrementing your drink count, you can kind of play with those settings. One other thing to note here is that with this application, I'm using Firebase as a very simple like backend / persistent database. But I'm doing that also so that we can see how to interact with async APIs and if the libraries are opinionated there. So I guess let's ground this conversation with how I typically like to kind of model my application from like a state management perspective. So I've been a big fan of having a global kind of representation of the entire application state, and allowing each feature to pluck out like a slice of that global state that it needs. In a similar vein, I also like having some isolated features with clear inputs and outputs, but otherwise they don't really care too much about the outside world, which makes it kind of easy to fake input and develop these like sample applications that are like mini applications that you can run in a sandbox. And then obviously the big one is unidirectional data flow. You've probably heard about this kind of ad nauseum, but having a clear way that data flows through your application, how actions flow into the system, and how state flows out and there being a single source of truth for the state that is kind of driving your feature. All right, so let's talk about Mavericks. It's a library by Airbnb. Like I said before, I think the primary or the progenitor is Gabriel Peel. I know he's now at Tonal, and I believe they use it there as well. It's built on top of Jetpack view models and coroutines, so it is very similar. It'll feel, and as I've used it, it felt very similar to just building using like stock Android components. And I guess the core concepts here are, and we'll look at the code in a minute, but we need to extend the Mavericks view model, which does some of the, or it does the majority of like the state management stuff for us. We create a state class which will extend Maverick state, and that's just an interface actually that doesn't do anything, it's just used by the system internally. And the way we consume state from the composable or from the compose side is you can grab your view model and then you call this collect a state function, which will return a state type of whatever your state, whatever your Maverick state is. And we'll see, but when you change, if you want to update your state in the view model itself, you're just gonna call just that state function that's provided by the Mavericks view model. And it makes it really nice to kind of like update your state from the existing state and based on like the action that occurred. All right, so I'm going to now transition into the code demonstration for this. And the way that I'm doing this is like, I'm gonna like briefly go over the concepts of the library and then I'll walk through the code of how I built this application using this particular library, just so that like maybe the concepts are a little bit fresher in your head rather than like walking through both and then demoing both. So see if it works. Yeah, so this is the Mavericks application, and I'll actually, let me just deploy it really quickly too. So as I can see, let me make sure I'm on the right branch. And yeah, so I'm gonna run it, let it reload. While it's reloading, I will, I'll kind of walk through it. So the way I'm going to walk through it is essentially I'll go through like a particular feature and kind of go through all the components that we're kind of using this library, and hopefully that'll cover like basically how data flows and how it's like how this library kind of works at a high level. So I guess starting from the view layer, right, I have this top level app composable. So again, this is a Jetpack Compose first application. So it's going to be a single activity, and all it's doing is rendering this application. And now that the application's loaded, just to like quickly walk through the features again, you have like the ability to update your hydration level. You can change things like your goal in the settings. I can update the goal and I can update my drink count. And then I can also navigate to the streaks and I can reset it if I need to. So yeah, kind of like what you saw in the screenshots. So looking at how I built this with Mavericks, the compose part is pretty agnostic of that. We have the app top level composable. It's doing a few things that aren't that important, but I guess the important part here is that we have navigation part, which is, I'm just using compose navigation very crudely here. And then we have each feature is represented by like this top level surface composable. So like I have a hydration composable, which represents the entire screen for this hydration feature. I have the streaks one and I have the settings one. And the way that state is being passed to it is it's being passed by the view model. So I'm grabbing a kind of a reference to the view model via this convenience function, which is essentially just grabbing the view model from the view model provider. And this one is going to be an activity scoped view model because, like I mentioned, I kind of want to have this be have this view model kind of like act as like a global state holder. So the app view model is actually going to be globally used by all the features, and we're going to get state from the app view model, and then the actions are all going to be forwarded to the same view model. So I guess really quickly looking at the view model, let's look at it piece by piece. So again, I talked about the state, so we can quickly look at the state that this view model is using. This is the global like app state, and one of the things that Mavericks likes to, I guess, be opinionated about is having your state represented as data classes. So we have this app state and it's extending the Maverick state. It has a few properties that are actually just mainly going to be used by each of the, I guess, child substates here. So if we look at the derived properties here, we have like something that will be used by the hydration feature, which is like the current hydration. We have the streak state, which uses some of the data from the app state. And then we have the setting state, which also kind of uses some of the data from the app state. And so essentially what's happening is that we have the view model, which is basically generic on the state. And so it's using the state as the global state. But if we go back to the actual feature, each of the features are kind of plucking out the portion of the state that it cares about. And Mavericks kind of has a way to do this, which is like they have this collect at state and this property mapper function, which allows us to only, I guess, only observe the piece of the state that we care about. So in each of these features, I'm only plucking out like the little piece of state that I care about for each of the features. So like for the hydration feature, I'm grabbing the current hydration, which is in itself a hydration state. So this is like the feature. This is all the data that we are using to drive what we're rendering for the hydration feature. I know I'm jumping around a lot, so I'll go back to the view model. So again, we're extending Mavericks view model. We're passing it the initial state. This will actually be created for us by Mavericks, and we're also passing it this environment. This is something that I just built, which is just a wrapper. It's a data class, which is a wrapper around some of the dependencies that the view model is going to be using. The string repository is just a way to interact with Firebase, and then this dates is just going to be a dates helper. And then just one quick thing to explain is that one of the ways that we can actually pass these dependencies to the view model, Mavericks has a way where you just create a companion object that extends this Mavericks view model factory. And then if Mavericks detects that we've created this companion object in the view model, it's going to use it to create the view model. And in this case, I'm just grabbing the dependencies from the application and supplying it to the environment, creating the environment here, and then passing that to the view model. But there's also like documentation on just how to use Dagger with this as well. So, but again, I left Dagger out for simplicity's sake. Cool. Okay, so going back, we have the application, and if we look at this hydration composable, it's actually also forwarding the view model, forwarding the actions, and I think this is like the core part of it. So the view model now has like this one entry point, which is accepting the actions that exist in this application. And the way I modeled that is just a like this app action sealed class, and this represents all the all of the actions that can take place in the application. And now the view model is really just like it's initializing with some state, and then it has this function that accepts actions and then updates state. So with the context of the hydration feature, one of the actions is I take a drink, right? So I click on the plus button and I'm forwarding this action to the view model. Ignoring this for right now, let's look at the set state function. So I mentioned this before, but this is really just like a method to like it. Set state is essentially just like kind of like a state reducer where it gives you access to the current version of the state as a receiver So like it is this in the context of this function, and then all you need to do is because the app state is a data class, you can just call copy and update any of the fields of the state that you want to update. In this case, I am getting that hydration for that particular day, and I am updating it with the drink amount. Otherwise, I'm just returning the hydration for any other day. So that is how the action flows, and then it'll update the state, and then that state will propagate back to the composable, and it updates, right? Pretty simple and straightforward. And so now we have this one place where all the actions kind of live. And then I kind of glossed over this, but like one of the things I'm doing, and this might not be, I mean, it's kind of like a dumb way of doing it, honestly, but I'm doing two things when some of these actions occur. In this case, I'm actually just taking the current state and I'm launching a coroutine that will talk to Firebase and update it. Update Firebase with like the new values, and in conjunction, and I'm also setting like the in-memory state. So this might not be I guess the smartest way to do it, but it does work. So yeah, it works for this application. One other thing I want to kind of like talk about here is that there's a nice side effect of like modeling state in this way, where is that like since all the features are kind of talking to and eventually updating this global state and then plucking their values from that global state, it makes like sharing data or like having features kind of like have updated state based on like other features that might have changed the data. It makes that pretty like straightforward. So for example, I have those three features. I can reset the drink amount here, and then because it's talking to the global state, all I do, like when I navigate to streaks, that value is getting updated based on what my current hydration level is. And similarly, if I navigate to the settings, right now I have like a drink size of 15 ounces and a goal of 16. So like each one will be a roughly 1/10. But if I were to go back to the settings and make my drink size 32, then that gets updated immediately, and you can see that I'm getting it's getting closer to gold per increment. Oops. And then similarly, I can also like lower the goal, and you can see that reflected. So yeah, pretty cool. And yeah, I think that that's mostly what I want to cover with how I set up, I guess, how I set up the application using Mavericks. It's pretty simple, not anything too complicated. So let me actually go back to my slides and continue forward. So yeah, I guess like that was just a brief overview of like, I guess I ran through one feature and how I built it with Mavericks and how things flow through the system and how we update state using Mavericks. So now let's move on and talk about workflow. So workflow is actually quite a bit more complicated, and I'll get to that in a second. But like I said before, it's a library by Square. It was created. I think the primary creators are Ray Ryan and Zach Klippenstein. I know Ray Ryan, I believe he's still at Square, and Zach is now working at Google doing Compose things. But I think they're still the core maintainers of the library. And the way that is described in the documentation is it's a set of composable state machines. So you'll start to think of your application as a tree of state machines where kind of like you have a parent level state machine, and it might have children where the outputs might flow into another state machine that has inputs and outputs that flow into another state machine, so on and so forth. And I'll get to that in a little bit. The core concepts that I'll touch on in more detail are these concepts of workflows, which are kind of the replacement of how I was using a view model. They're going to be the primary like state machine where actions flow into the system and new states generated. There's another concept called workers, which is just like an opinionated way of doing getting asynchronous data and then getting that data to feed back into the system. And there's another concept of view creators, which is essentially just like a factory that will create your view. But I'll touch that in this next slide. So workflows, and you'll see this in the code, but they're generic on 4 types. They have props, which is data that they get from the parent. They have state, which is their internal state. They have their output, which is data that they're going to feed back to the parent. And they have this rendering, which is essentially the view state, but also like an action collector. So it is all the data that the view will need to render, as well as maybe some lambdas to pass actions back to the workflow. And then I talk about workers, but the only other thing to mention is that they're essentially just a wrapper around coroutine flows. And then view creators. So view creators, like I said, were factories that create views, or in our case, they'll kind of create the composable hierarchies. And they're going to be mapped to these specific rendering types. And you'll see that in a moment. But essentially, we use these rendering types for each of the feature. And the view creators will be typed specifically to a particular rendering type. All right, so I know I just briefly got into the slides, but I'm going to go back into the code, and we're going to walk through kind of a similar flow, but we're going to go through it with workflow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stash workflow. Okay, and I am going to build the application. All right, so now it's rebuilt. And now this is the same exact application, but it's being powered by a completely different state library. And so let's see what changed. And actually, surprisingly, a lot, or I guess not surprisingly, a lot of the stuff is being reused. So basically, I walked through, well, actually, if I go to the main activity, you'll now see that like I kind of have like these 2 entry point composables. So like if I wanted to, I can kind of go back to the Mavericks application. But in this case, I am actually rendering the workflow variant. And just going through the code, it looks very similar. It's not doing any navigation here. Workflow actually has an opinionated way that it does navigation. And we'll look at that in a sec. But yeah, it kind of looks similar in the sense that like we're getting something as a state from a workflow, but instead we're using this workflow rather than the view model. And then we're passing it to something that helps us render that. And so why don't we look at it in the context of the flow for the this hydration feature again, but see how it's built with workflow. So I think the key difference here is that instead of that global app view model, we do have another parent a parent, I guess, state management thing that does operate on the global view state, and it's called the workflow, right? And so let's touch on the things that I had mentioned before. It's generic on those types. Okay, so it's generic on the props, state, output, and rendering. So for this parent workflow, we're just going to ignore props and output because it's the parent. It doesn't get any props. And for the output, it doesn't have any output necessarily. And then it's going to operate on, there's a workflow state. And then its rendering type is going to be this backstack screen. So this backstack screen is actually something that's provided by workflow, and because they're kind of because it's opinionated on navigation, this is just like a way that I figured out how to like have backstack support. But for the most part, like if you look at the documentation for the parent, you might just like have this be like a sealed class type, or even just like an any type, which is what like we're using here. So because this parent workflow is going to delegate all of its state management and rendering logic to the child workflows, and I'll show you how that works. And then the state that it's operating on is this workflow state, but you can see that like it's basically just a wrapper around the global app state, which is the same exact app state that I'm using with the Mavericks variant. And the way it's set up here is because these are actually like kind of like the navigation targets for this workflow. So each of these states, like hydration machine, streaks machine, settings machine, is going to navigate to a particular, it's going to navigate to that particular feature. And then that particular feature's workflow is going to take over and kind of handle its internal state. And then I also have this initial load one, which is actually just going to like load the data from Firebase using a worker. But we can touch on that in a moment. So I guess like looking at the things that are important in this are, I'll get to this in a sec, but we have this render function. And this is where it's kind of, this is how I guess workflow mainly differs from how I was using Mavericks with that global app view model. And in this render function, we're essentially going to delegate to a bunch of child workflows. In this case, I have this hydration workflow, which is responsible for the screen that you're seeing right here. So if we dive into that, it's another workflow, but this time we're actually populating some of these fields. And so its props are going to be the app state, and then its state is going to be that hydration state that was actually being used before to power this feature again in Mavericks, right? And then it's going to have an output, which is actually pretty cool because this is a way that we can communicate state updates back to the parent. So like ignoring these two, which are used for navigation, I have this update state output, which will give the parent the updated version of this local feature state. And then it has the hydration rendering. And this rendering is just going to be used by the composables, and it's literally just a wrapper around the state. And then it has ways to pass like action commands and navigation commands. So looking at this workflow, the way that state updates happen is you have these things called workflow actions, which are essentially the same thing as like that set state function in Mavericks. So it gives you access to the previous version of the state, and then you can kind of have it be generic on some, or you can have it take in some action type, and then it will basically do the same things that you saw in the app view model, right? In the set state function. set state function, it's happening it's essentially like this function here, right? The main difference is that for the hydration workflow here, it's now actually not operating on the global state anymore, and it's operating on the local state, which is actually pretty interesting. So now all of like the actions that a particular feature needs to handle can be handled within its own kind of like isolated workflow rather than by that global app view model, which is pretty cool. And also it's no longer has to do like all of the, I guess, like updating of the global state. So like when I press this button, I'm sending an action into the system. The action is just going to take the current hydration state and update it based on what I just drank, what my current drink amount is, and how much I need to increment it by. But then I actually can pass the state update as an output. So if we like I mentioned, we can look at where this is used, and I can use this in the app workflow, where I can just hook into the output of various child workflows and decide like how I want to use their output to update the global state. And so in this particular case, I'm just getting that, and then I'm replacing that state for that particular weekday with the output, because that is going to be the latest version of that state. So I guess one thing I haven't touched on here is like that piece where I talked about workers, and workers are I can just quickly touch on it here, but it's really just like a way to get some asynchronous data and then have it feed back into the system. So in this case, this initial load worker is just going to get the initial data for how many drinks are from the drink repository, and it expects you to return like a flow, like a type of flow of whatever type your worker is generic on. In this case, I'm just giving it an app state, so it can initialize an app state. And then you can just use any of your coroutine powered asynchronous data fetching things and generate an app state and then emit it. And the way that that's used is, again, going into this render function down here. When it's the initial load state, I can just call this context running worker and pass it that worker. And then when I get that state output, I can handle that here and set the state. Yeah, and then I think the last thing I want to touch on here is the main difference on the view side. So looking at the hydration feature, I mentioned those view factories. So I created this view factory, which is just a binding to that rendering type. And this is essentially just using that same composable. And now it's just like using the data from the rendering type rather than directly from the view model and the state type. And then the way that that's used is if we go to where we added it, we can just set up all of these bindings in a way where workflow has them available in a registry, and then it basically uses that to determine, based on the rendering that we're getting from the workflow, which view are we going to then create based on that rendering type. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there. I know I just like spit out a bunch of words at you, and that's probably a lot to take in. So I'm just gonna go really quickly back to my presentation and take a breather. So I know I threw a lot of information at you, but I kind of want to ground it again by how I wanted to compare those two libraries and how they were used. So again, I was going to compare it on these three verticals: complexity, how complex it was is used, how opinionated it was, and how well documented it was. So for Mavericks, I felt like it was fairly easy to use. It felt like just like it felt very similar to just standard Android development using Android like Jetpack components. So there wasn't a huge learning curve. Um, it's somewhat opinionated in regards to how state needs to be modeled to some degree, and how like I guess state updates occur, but it doesn't really have any sort of like opinion on like how to set up your entire application, how features might uh, I guess communicate with each other, whether each like composable feature should have its own view model or kind of like what I did, which is have a single global view model. um, However, like that approach of having that global view model could kind of break down as the app gets more complex. You're just going to have this giant kind of God object that handles all the action and all the state updates, which might be a little bit unwieldy. Um, but from the documentation standpoint, Mavericks is very well documented. The docs covered basically everything I needed to know to build this application. Um, and it covered a lot of like use cases of like common issues you might run into, or just like various use cases that are a little bit more complex. So I was really impressed with their documentation. For workflow, I would say complexity wise, it's like medium slash hard to use. And I'll caveat that by saying initially, once I kind of got the hang of it, it felt pretty nice to use. But again, it still was a little bit um, difficult to reason about because it's kind of uh, far. It's kind of different from just normal Android development. The system that they built is very Android agnostic. Um, so it is kind of like learning a new language in a way. Um, that being said, it's very opinionated. It kind of breaks down how to model your entire application, and it models it in a way that kind of makes sense, which is this tree of composable state machines, and having like a root level tree, a root level node, and having all of these different nodes that kind of like are their own contained system, internal system that we can kind of like plug in and out of our application. So I think it's really powerful in the way that it documents how state flows through the system, how parents can talk to children, and how children can then talk to parents, and then how views consume that state. Yeah, I think that it's pretty robust in that regard. And then for documentation side, I would say that it's documented pretty fairly. There's a decent amount of documentation on like the concepts and learning about it. But I ran into issues when I tried to do even like simple things with regards to like finding out how to do navigation, and finding out how to I don't know, how to even like propagate output from children to the parent. Those things didn't seem like they were very well documented, and I did have to do a little bit of like source diving and looking up samples. And eventually, I was able to find some things, but I think those things could be a little bit clearer in the documentation, and I think it would have made it a lot easier for me to kind of get started and build things that are a little bit like a level above like the very easy complexity. Um, so what are my takeaways here? I guess like just comparing these two libraries, I would say that like Mavericks was the fastest to get something out the door, and it was very easy to use and reason about. But I think that workflow is very compelling, because like the way that it's set up like shows that like it has the potential to scale to like very complex applications because of the way that it it manages its state and allows like each kind of like small feature or sub feature, and you can model even like even that screen for them for showing like your current hydration in the app. You can model that as like multiple small components that have their own like state machine that feed into parents and feed back up to like the parents and things like that. So I think like the mental model is a little bit harder to grasp initially, and it's also a little bit awkward to use at first. But I think that like I'd like to like continue to use it and figure out um, uh, kind of figure out how the best way uh, for me personally to use it would be. So um, yeah, I know it's probably been a little bit long, so just want to say thanks. That's it for now. I do plan on continuing kind of like exploring these topics, and hopefully we'll have updates for future talks, or maybe even have time to dive deeper into some of those libraries or even more. Um, I'll add a link to like the code that for this application on GitHub, as well as links to the Mavericks and workflow libraries. And yeah, if you want to talk to me about architecture, Compose, Android, or anything really, reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at Hey Rikin. Um, and that is it.
All right, thanks, Rikin, for that presentation. So we'll just wait a minute for some questions to roll in. I see we've got a couple coming in now. I once had this thought that in the sense the universe is like a giant state machine. And I don't know if that actually makes sense or not. It's either one of the best ideas I've ever had or it was just a terrible one. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think after working in workflow, that's like my brain is like, oh, everything's a state machine now.
Yeah.
Everything's a state machine that's feeding into smaller state machines. So
Yep.
yeah, it's been funny.
Awesome. All right. I see we got a couple of questions rolling in. So if you can stop presenting, I can then start putting the questions on the stage there. Perfect. And yeah, just answer them in whatever order you would like, and I'll have them pop up on the stage there.
Sure. So I can look at the Q&A section. Shalom asked a question. Under what circumstances do you think it makes sense to use Mavericks or Workflow instead of rolling your own? Seems like both are complex to learn and get more complicated as I scale, which is a deterrent. I would say that Mavericks is probably like the easiest for getting something out the door quickly. It's like the way I would describe it is it adds like just enough like convenience to some of like the things that you might already use, so that like you get rid of a lot of boilerplate. I think that it will get more complex. So if you're going to like leverage it from the ground up, you might want to be a little bit disciplined with using it. But I think like workflow, it's just like a high learning curve. So like you have to like spend the time to learn it, which you might not want to, because again, like I guess you're trusting a third-party library to handle like the core like logic of your application. But I think that like that one would probably be the most compelling for like any sort of larger scale application. I feel like just it feels like that one would be the easiest to like scale out once you have like the base infrastructure in place. But kind of to answer your initial question, I think that like eventually, as your app scales, you probably want to roll your own solution, just so you have full control over everything. But I think that using these libraries, you get a lot of good ideas. You kind of get ideas on like how other big companies, so like Square says they're using this for like a lot of their core applications, which are fairly large, and supposedly Airbnb and Tonal are both using Mavericks for seemingly large applications as well. So there's proof that it scales. I mean, again, these are the companies that develop these libraries, so take that with a grain of salt. But yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Cool.
Gabor asks, which of these libraries would you say is easier to save state with a cross-process death?
Again with the process dev.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny seeing him in the questions because I know he's very opinionated on modeling state as like these giant state classes, and I know he's definitely not in the favor of that camp. So hopefully you're just shutting your eyes there for that part of the presentation, Gabor. But regards to process depth, actually they both did have like in-house solutions. I actually didn't cover them, but like they both had ways to preserve state with process stuff. Like workflow had this concept of snapshots, which you could leverage when your application process is terminated. And I think Mavericks had like an annotation for your data class to like make it so that it was like a parcelable. But I'm gonna have to get back to you on that one. And but yeah, I know that's very important to you, so I'll definitely get back to you.
I personally just don't handle process death.
You and many others, Ryan. I think
that was a joke in case I was not clear.
Well, I don't know if I was joking about many others not actually handling it, but
well, yeah. I think that's the truth right there.
Looks like you asked a question, Ryan.
Oh, that guy. Yeah.
Yeah, this guy. Are there any options for testing either library that you're familiar with? Are you asking like if
did you like have a chance to do they have testing APIs, and did you have like a chance? Because it seemed like they both really give you this scaffolding that you're kind of bound to. So I'm not super familiar with the style of architecture, so this might be a terrible question, but like if I wanted to sort of like test these sorts of things or the flows and so forth, are there options for that?
Yeah, actually, that's also one thing I didn't really get a chance to dive into too detail, but they both seemingly ship with some testing like primitives that make like setting up test fixtures for the like state management parts of the application pretty testable. I know Square workflow has like a pretty extensive like testing helper library that helps you test these workflows. And I think Mavericks also has some convenience testing helpers for testing Mavericks view models. But yeah, I didn't really get a chance to dive into it.
Okay, no worries. And they're both obviously fairly young libraries, and I find testing tends to be something that comes a little later. All right.
It's funny. I guess in a similar vein, does either framework complicate unit testing? I actually think that they don't complicate it. I think they're kind of built with unit testing in mind, and kind of goes to show that like they've built out like test helpers to kind of like encourage and make it easier to set up test fixtures. So hopefully the unit testing won't be as painful to set up. That being said, I did not do it, which is not atypical for me, I guess. For everyone in the public hearing, I do write unit tests. But for this particular case, I did not get to dive into it. But hopefully, I'll be like updating this presentation with and diving into like some of these other parts, like the testing features that JS libraries provide, and maybe I'll be able to answer that for you, Shalom.
And that's totally fair. Like as someone who's created tutorials, adding the testing stuff in when you just want to like teach some particular aspect can be a lot of overhead, and in many cases people don't even understand the basic fundamentals of testing, so no worries there at all. All right, do you have any final thoughts, Rikin?
I guess yeah, just thanks for having me. I always enjoy coming to Android Worldwide events. And yeah, thanks everyone who stayed and watched me ramble on about architecture.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, we've still got some solid numbers here.